Hi, I'm Max Clark. I work with a lot of cloud native companies spending millions of dollars a month on AWS. And something that comes up a lot that I end up talking about a lot is cost management and how you do cost reduction within AWS and what's the strategy that makes sense. A lot of what I'm going to talk about comes out of conversations and dealing with companies that are spending between $1 and $3 million on AWS. When I say $1 to $3 million, I mean a month. $1 to $3 million a month. So call it that like $10 to $30 million a year range. If you've already crossed $100,000 a month, so million-ish a year on AWS, and you're scaling up, this will apply to you. You might be a little bit ahead of the curve, which is good for you. If you are looking at EDP, this probably applies to you as well. If you're in a position where you actually are associating your cloud spend as a percentage of your revenue, this absolutely applies to you. So, if you know, like we're spending 12% of our revenue on our AWS spend, you're probably going to want to pay attention to this. I'm going to probably end up ranting around in a circle. Bear with me. A lot to try to cover and talk about. The first thing is how people try to approach their AWS spend, and spend reduction is just usually wrong. If you do not already have your AWS environment tagged, all of your resources tagged, don't spend any energy really trying to figure this out yet. You need to immediately try to figure out how to get your entire AWS environment tagged. If you can't correlate your cost on your platform and your infrastructure to revenue it is generating, you're not in a position to make decisions around what you're spending and how much you're spending and if it's effective for you to spend it or not. It's a foundational issue. This isn't a cost. We're not even talking about techniques to reduce your cost or tackle your costs. We're just talking about, do you know what you're spending money on and why? You can attach lots of tags. You can have things tagged automatically. If you're in any sort of auto-scaling groups, that auto-scaling group can have it, tags on it. If you're using infrastructure as code like Terraform, you can attach tags to it. You can attach tags to resource accounts that fire stuff up, to people that are, you can create multiple dimensions of different tags. The important thing is at the end of the day, being able to come back and say, this line of business, this product, this service, whatever it actually is for us, generates this much revenue, and this is what it costs us to run. Because you want to be able to have this conversation at a business level first and foremost. We are spending X to get Y. Does it make sense for us to do that? And I have had lots of clients when they actually go through this exercise and they get into a conversation where the business is now evaluating what they're spending versus what they're making. I've seen massive realignments in how things are done. Like we're just going to wholesale eradicate an entire line of service or line of business because it just doesn't make sense for us. That's a fine thing. It sounds crazy maybe to you if you're not doing it, but at the same time, that's the kind of decision you want to make. You want to find out that, hey, we've got a 70% margin on this thing and a 10% margin on this other thing, but that 10% margin is strategic for us. So we're going to continue to invest in it and grow it, but we understand what the margin is on it. Or you could say, hey, we've got this thing that's generating 10% of margin for us and we don't care about it. It's just there because it's legacy. Let's kill that thing off. And I'm going to tell you, if you've got an engineering team that's maintaining some sort of legacy anything and you tell them we're going to kill off this legacy application or service or whatever, because it's just doesn't make sense to the business, they're not going to cry about it. Chances are people are going to be really excited when you tell them this. So number one, if you're not tagging, tag. If you can't do cost reporting based on tags, tag. Always start with tagging. Now, I get asked a lot by providers in our portfolio about multi-cloud. How many of our clients do we see with multi-cloud? And my answer to that is almost everybody's maybe multi-cloud curious, but when it really comes down to it, at this size, usually not to the scale that anybody really thinks or expects. And there's reasons for that. And I'll circle back around to this in a little bit. But the big thing is when you start talking about an application that's, call it, $2 million a month in spend, or maybe you're smaller, maybe you're only $250,000 a month in spend. There just isn't an opportunity to take an entire, workload and shift it to another cloud effectively. GCP did a really good job attacking this, years ago, where they introduced a data pipeline with BigQuery and Bigtable. And the big thing that Google did that was really smart at that time was selling a fixed capacity or fixed slot processing. So you could have a fixed expense for your data pipeline. And this was great because you actually had controlled cost and you didn't have to worry about what was going on with there, and you could go crazy with it. It would just rate limit you and how much data and how much work it would do for you. But that was okay because it didn't really matter if it finished in 10 seconds versus 90 seconds versus, whatever, the predictability of cost was more important, and this of course was back, before Snowflake was what it is today. And there's different techniques that you can do with Redshift. Now, what happened is, GCP's leadership changed and they shot themselves in the foot. And they changed the pricing for BigQuery and Bigtable, and that in conjunction with AWS shenanigans, let's call them, drove a lot of people off this platform. So where it was common for me to see people in that like $20 million range have maybe 10, 15, 20% of their spend on GCP, I've seen all of that workload leave Google and go back to AWS and go back to single with AWS. I see a lot of vendors coming into market to do AWS, cloud spend management that immediately try to attack this issue with instance sizing. We're going to shut down instances at nighttime for your development team. But look, your development team is probably not large enough that turning off all the development instances is going to make a meaningful impact to you and your spend. I mean, it's going to get something, don't get me wrong, but it's not going to be like this massive win that's going to drastically change the, arc of your business. Unattached EBS volumes. I mean, yeah, of course, you've got them. You should find them. You should kill them off. It's costing you money. It's, but you figure out a way to do that. You can use a platform to do it, but it's not like finding lottery money by any means. Let's see here. What else do we see? A Spot. We see Spot a lot. By the way, we have vendors in our portfolio that manage Spot and Spot fleets. Big issue with Spot is you do get a big reduction against your on-demand cost because you're getting resources that haven't been allocated by AWS to something else. And the exchange of that is they can take those resources back from you at any time. So as long as your instance is relatively ephemeral, you can use Spot effectively. Places where I've seen that this becomes a really big issue is, of course, where instances aren't really ephemeral, or they have a long startup time or load penalty where they have to suck in a lot of data and it'll do a lot of things before that instance is actually ready to serve traffic. If you've got that kind of application, Spot is going to create other issues for you where now you have to maintain and figure out how to deal with state and seeding data in that instance in order to take advantage of the Spot fleet. And that maybe is engineering time you should be spending on other things. We're going to come back to EDPs. I'm going to make an EDP note now, but we're going to come back to EDPs. The conversation that I end up in with any provider that's offering a bare metal service or a platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, any sort of alternative computing platform to the public cloud, right? So for some reason we call them hyperscalers, but I'll just say public cloud, the AWS, GCP, whatever of the worlds, is trying to attack this as a cost per compute or cost per byte of storage. And, just to put it out there, the cost of compute for an EC2 instance and the cost of byte of storage in S3, yes, you can save money moving to different platforms. And yes, you can save a good amount of money, but this isn't really the problem spends are. Cutting X%, maybe 10, 20% of your EC2 cost or, 10, 20, 30% of your S3 cost. It's meaningful, but it's not meaningful enough to actually drive, that level of change where an organization is going to switch out of AWS, move out of their cloud platform to go onto a different system. It's just that cost reduction isn't worth the pain, right? The pain that they're dealing with doesn't, going to that organization and saying, hey, you're spending 12% of your revenue on EC2 and, on AWS, and the bulk of that's on EC2. It's like 60% of your spend is on EC2, and we're going to cut 10% of that out. And you're going to go from 12% of spend of, revenue on spend, and you're going to go to 10.5% of revenue on spend. The engineering time and the resources and the risk and the question and the fear that you generate with that, you're going to spend a lot of cycles. And I will say this in two ways. One is to vendors trying to sell this stuff. If you're wondering why your lead cycles are insanely long and don't convert, that's why. And if you're on the procurement, sourcing, whatever side of this thing, if you're an IT team managing DevOps, SecOps, whatever you want to call yourselves nowadays, I don't care how your org is titling you. Also, you're going to be barking up the wrong tree with this one. We should also talk about KPIs. I'm going to come back to that too as well. The killer for you in your cloud platform is not what you think it is. It's actually moving data around. It's not storing data. It's not processing, it's processing to some degree. And it's not uploading data because they make sure, if you look at the billing structure, ingress is free. It's only the egress that's the issue. But moving data around and understanding how data is flowing through your environment is the place where you really should be looking at and understanding what your spend is. And boy, they make this really hard for you to understand if you're looking at your invoicing. There's I don't want to say there's a reason why the invoicing is so insane and hard to understand. And what you're missing within that is what you're paying really to move data around, right? And look, there's some mistakes that you can do in terms of like intra-AZ, that's going to cost you a fortune in data. There's, if you're talking between, what used to be like VPCs or, intra-AZ, intra-region, kind of stuff, you're probably getting fleeced without realizing it. If you're moving data between regions, There's managed NAT gateways. There's a ton of money there. And in that example, let's say a $2 million a month account, maybe that account is spending $600,000 to $800,000 a month in EC2, but they're also going to be spending $300,000 to $400,000 in data egress, and maybe $200,000-$300,000 a month on Kinesis. This is a really common, and then you've got your RDS instances, and then your S3 buckets, and then Redshift and some kind of like odds and ends that flow around in that stuff. Now, what's interesting to me about that is when we talk about data egress is where these public clouds are just absolutely crushing you in terms of what their cost is and margin on this. 5 cent per gig egress. It's a joke. It's an absolute joke. I mean, it's a 3,000% margin or something. I've done the math a bunch of times in other videos. If you're really curious, we can maybe link it below here. But the big savings I see when people talk about, and I hate this term, repatriatization, because so many companies are cloud native, right? You can't really say we're coming back into a data center because you weren't in the data center in the first place. But selectively moving workloads out of a public cloud platform into a bare metal platform, there's lots of cases where maybe that is driven by a resource constraint. You can't get enough NVMe drive. You can't have enough, fast enough disk. You need a faster network interconnect. You want to have 100 gig or X by 100 gig interconnects between your servers. You want to do real, you're doing AI ML in a real serious way, and you want to have InfiniBand between your servers. You need more storage that you can get that's actually attached to the node. Like, you want to have a specific CPU combination at a higher quantity. You want to have, like, these sorts of things drive bare metal. They just do, because you can't get it out of the cloud platform. And what's also funny about this is it's not necessarily price drives this, but it's not price driving that decision as much as people want to believe it is. It's usually like, we actually just can't do our job. If we're here in AWS, we need to do something else because we need to do X, Y, and Z. And oh, by the way, that comes with a big cost savings. And then, by the way, it's a big cost savings, right? You're making a trade. There's different impacts, right? You lose the ephemerality. And I would argue that you don't really have the ephemerality that you think you do, because you're buying RIs and savings plans and doing all other stuff that eradicate the ephemerality. So you have the sense of ephemerality, right? It's the pretend lie that you have ephemerality. So you just have to think about your environment a little different, right? And how you manage it. Maybe you're on a 12-month deal with a bare metal provider, which we do all the time with our clients. So it's really the data, right? So we talk a little bit about egress. And by the way, there's different techniques here that you can do, and we can talk about if it makes sense to you, but there's different ways of managing your egress. You can change your NAT gateways. By the way, these are usually big wins for companies. Little simple things. I've seen, old technique I've been doing for 20 years, literally sit down with your team and draw out your pipeline. The whole trying to do it in Visio or Lucidchart or whatever you're using today, Miro, you'll never finish these things. By the time you actually document the diagram, your environment's already changed. Literally sit down with people and draw it on a whiteboard and talk through the different steps. And as you ask questions about how things are being processed and actually work through, you're going to find some fun stuff like, oh, we have an ingress pipeline that takes data from the internet, goes to an ELB, and then hits an autoscaling group. And, we've been pushed to go to serverless. So we're using Lambda. Then after, or we're taking to an autoscaling group, which then puts into an S3 bucket, which then fires off, this thing in Lambda, which then puts it into Kinesis, which then runs another Lambda thing, which then puts it back into Kinesis, which puts it into it goes through an ELB to another autoscaler group, which goes back to Kinesis, which then writes to DynamoDB. It sounds funny, and that's not ever possible. That is a real world example from a client. And that client, by the way, also had another issue, which is when they created their DynamoDB tables, they never set TTLs on them. And so they just had this, growing expense in Dynamo. And when it became a problem and they recognized what was there, ended up having a decision paralysis issue because they couldn't, going through and retroactively assigning TTLs to rows. The time and the cost of it was just so high, like so absurdly high to actually put TTLs, inside of their, it's just so funny to think about at this point. They actually ended up deciding to start writing to a second DynamoDB database and with a TTL on that one, and ran them in parallel for 13 months. And then when they hit the 13-month mark, they just dropped the first database and eradicated it. And that was modeled out to be cheaper than trying to go back and retroactively assign TTLs and deal with the actual cost within AWS. Managed services inside of AWS is a big topic for me a lot. And there's points where it doesn't make sense for you to figure out how to do another thing. Under a certain dollar amount, it's worth it to run EKS versus running Kubernetes natively inside of your infrastructure, or running containers in a different way. I've had clients with an auto-scaling group, when the EC2 instance starts, it just downloads and loads the container and fires the container up. There is no Kubernetes involved. It's just container management for software delivery with no complexity of Kubernetes, which was actually crazy, but at the same time really smart in ways, just because it was a very simplistic environment for them to manage. And there's different container platforms that give you different, like you don't have to be on Kubernetes. There's different ways of doing this. So anyways, EKS versus Kubernetes, Kafka versus Kinesis, Cassandra, Cycla versus DynamoDB. And these things all run on top of an EC2 instance inside of your AWS environment. It's just, do you need to pay the premium for the managed branded service from AWS or not? And again, there's points where it doesn't make sense. And then there's points where all of a sudden it makes a lot of financial sense to change that. And also there are service providers in the market that we work with and this is all they do, right? You don't have to run Kinesis and pay the premium for the AWS branded Kafka. We can just install and run Kafka and manage it for you on top of EC2. And it's going to give you the exact same thing. And it's going to cost you a whole heck of a lot less. So these become like, and again, we're not talking about leaving AWS here. We're just saying, how are you deploying resources and what atomic unit inside of AWS are you actually consuming? Because the atomic units inside of AWS, compute and storage, these are really good. Like they're really good. And yes, you're going to save money if you don't use them and you go somewhere else. But if you're already there, the switching cost, you have to model it out and you have to figure it out. And as much as some of our providers and portfolio want to pretend like this happens, I mean, the reality is it just doesn't to the scale that anybody really thinks it does. I want to talk about KPIs. Let's talk about KPIs for a moment. And if you want to attack this, you have to make this an issue across the organization, right? You can't just go to your finance department and say, hey, finance or procurement or sourcing, I need you to figure out how to save us 10, 15% on AWS this year. We got to lower our cost 20%. They have no control over any levers to actually do that. The only levers they have control over is they can buy a savings plan, they can buy RIs, and they can sign an EDP. Those three things, maybe not what you want, okay? So you're putting them in a position where they don't actually have levers or control over what you're trying to drive as an outcome. I've seen this as well with, what you would call like a DevOps team, where the DevOps team is in charge of the cloud environment, and cost management and cost control becomes part of their responsibility. But they're not actually building the platform and making architecture choices for how it's used. And that engineering team, and this is a verbatim quote, it came from a client, DevOps team, IT team was trying to make changes and get changes made. And they wanted to do things a little differently, not radically differently, just a little differently, and got into a conversation with an engineering lead about spend. And let's do something a little different that's going to drastically change how we're spending money in AWS. And the engineering lead looked at the DevOps lead and it's so funny to think about, literally said to him, that's not my KPI. I don't have to worry about that. I mean, show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome, right? So it's just so funny to think about still to this day. But it's really true. That engineering lead had a completely separate, disconnected set of priorities that they were being judged on and had to achieve, right? What was their performance of the application, speed of delivery, product cycle, like all these other things become big influences for your engineering team. What is your product roadmap? What kind of, are you on Agile? You're trying to do sprints? What's your, how do you fit all this stuff into there with them? And by the way, this is why I go back to tagging. You can introduce tagging without spending developer time to get it done. So you can get a lot of information insight about your environment without blowing engineering time before you actually make decisions of like, hey, this is where we're spending money and we're going to change these things because it's just not worth it to us. So this has to be like executive owned, push down the ranks of we're going to deal with this. Okay, let's get into the EDP and talk about EDPs. EDPs start showing up once you cross, it's about $500,000 a year is what it feels like. So if you're spending around $50K a month on AWS, you're probably starting to get phone calls from your named account rep at Amazon talking to you about these different programs. And again, this is what they're incentivized to do. So that's what they're going to do. You are making a trade. The EDP is going to give you a discount in exchange for future commitments of spend. Okay. You're just horse trading. It's important to really understand and think about that. If you are getting a 10% discount across the board on your AWS bill, AWS is getting that money back from you in the future. You're kicking the can down the road. And this gets realized a couple of different ways. The most common thing is that you're going to have an annualized commitment of multi-year typically. Right now, look, if you're doing your first EDP, you're going to have a lot more leverage. The big secret here is it's heroin, right? Like the first one's free, and then it gets more expensive every time you come back, right? Because now you're used to the discount, you're budgeting around it. Like you just, your optionality and your leverage decreases with each renewal. Let's just say you're at $1 million a year in spend. And, this EDP thing sounds great to you, right? And let's say you got an offer for a 10% reduction, right? So, you're going to go from $1 million to $900,000, right? Like it's meaningful. Like you're talking about, staffing a role usually at that point, right? Like you've got space and budget to do something with it now that you were already spending that just materializes out of thin air. That's usually a good trade. Problem is now you've just committed yourself to spending $1.1 million at a 10% discount. And then year 3, you've also got another increase. And then when you come back year 4 to get an EDP renewal, you're going to get your baseline reestablished at where you're at. It is now, again, if you're in early cycles with EDP, like you're doing your first one, maybe you can negotiate away from being required to purchase enterprise support. At some point, it's going to be forced on you. This is the point that really makes just like, I've seen this so many times. It's incredible. It's like, oh, we're signing this deal with AWS. Oh, you get a 10% discount, but then at the same time, you've got to spend 10%, 8 to 12% on enterprise support. So it's like, great, you've saved money on this bucket, but then immediately spend it on this bucket. And oh, by the way, each year, your buckets are increasing. The secret with the EDP is negotiating PPAs. And if you're not negotiating PPAs across each of your services, that's where you're leaving the money on the table. And this is where you attack your egress costs and data exchange and like basically anything that AWS, look, at the right commitment, everything is negotiable, right? You just have to understand that what you're trading, like this isn't free money for you. You are making a trade, buying an RI to get the maximum discount. You're paying, you're giving AWS an advance, and you're buying that, you're prepaying for your usage of that thing at a lower margin. And, you're switching columns in Excel on how how they're realizing that. And it's going from like, oh, this is an on-demand resource with no, recurring revenue at X margin. And in exchange, you're going to prepay us for 3 years, or maybe it's not a prepaid. Maybe you're just signing a 3-year deal for the RI, and we're switching you from non-recurring to recurring revenue. And we see, it's better. It's more valuable for us, right? So it's worth less margin. The evils with EDPs that I've seen, of course, become these escalators, and the renewals. Escalators and renewals are really emotionally complicated topics within teams. And this is also why at this size, multi-cloud doesn't become the reality that people think that is. And I've seen lots of clients get bound up where, we talk about that, oh, we had that 10% of our spend was on GCP because we were doing our data pipeline there, but now we have a shortfall in AWS that we're contractually committed. We're writing that check, right? Like we're not spending the money there. We're not using the resource, but we're still writing the check for it. And what happens? It's like, oh, we start looking for things to backfill that gap, right? That shortfall. And I've seen almost every single environment, that GCP, data pipeline, boom, immediately comes back to AWS. When I say immediately, it takes a lot of time and engineering resources and a bunch of stuff. It's painful, but it comes back. I've seen CDN relationships end because they needed the revenue to go into CrowdFront in order to come up with shortfalls. Like we were talking about like core process and core infrastructure for this company and how they were actually leveraging their CDN and losing functionalities and features and things that they actually needed to re-architect application as a result of it, but they had to come up with that shortfall. Or it's like, hey, how do we get things that we're spending that we have direct relationships with into the AWS marketplace in order to get spend drawdowns? And, when that happens, like maybe the first year you're getting a 1-for-1, but then you're getting lower and lower ratios, out of that spend commitment. So maybe you move New Relic or Datadog back into AWS, into the marketplace and buy it there in order to deal with your spend. But, oh, guess what? You were getting 1-for-1, but now you're getting 50 cents on the dollar, and then you're getting 20 cents on the dollar, and then you're getting 10 cents on the dollar. And, that just changes. Like you have no control over that. Like all of a sudden, like, sands to shift underneath your feet. This is much longer than what I usually do for these. There's a lot more to this topic. We can get into this, it's complicated. And a lot of this depends. I'm trying to give really generic information that applies as a whole. I'll circle back to the beginning of this, which is if you're not already doing it, You have to tag all of your resources, and you have to be able to understand and correlate what you're spending money on with what revenue is coming in the door attached to it. And this is not development cycles. We're not talking about trying to get code coverage and unit tests across your entire environment where your developers have to write them. You just have to start enabling these things, and it just needs to be perfect enough. Like, don't worry about the strategy of how you're tagging these things. Just tag everything. And if you have to go retag everything later, then go retag everything later. Like, who cares? And if you got any sort of auto scaling anything, if you add the tags into it as the instance creates, your auto scaling group is going to end up retagging itself by itself with enough time. So just do it, and just arm yourself with enough information that you can actually start making like informed decisions of like, is this good or not? Like, do we spend money here or not? Are we spending too much money here based on what we're making? Are we losing money here? Is this strategic? Is this not? Is this essential for this other service? Is it not? Is this a line of business that we don't want anymore? Is it not? It's not sexy, but boy, tagging and being able to do, proper analysis of spend is where you have to start. And then from there, we can talk about how you're spending money and how do you approach maybe spending less money, provided, of course, you don't have an EDP that's forcing you to spend the money. But then we can have a conversation and we can talk about whether or not bare metal makes sense for you. We can talk about if switching off of a managed service makes sense for you. And maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But you got to have the information in order to know, and you have to understand the trade-offs, right? And then at least you're informed and you can understand the trade-offs. Yeah, it's complicated. It's simple, but it's complicated. Anyways, I'm Max Clark. Rant on, really AWS spending and cost management. I hope this helps. If you have any questions, comment below, reach out. Happy to chat, happy to help. I've seen some really crazy stuff. Don't worry, it's more normal. Whatever you got going on is more normal than you think. You're not alone. I hope this helps you. Have a great day.